Wyatt Holloway never liked mornings in Maple Creek because they started the same way every day. Grey light creeping through cracked windows, the smell of stale oil drifting through his small garage, and the old radio playing yesterday's news. Bidub, but this morning was different. He stood by the rusted garage door, mug of burnt, coffee in hand, staring at the quiet road that ran past his shop like a forgotten promise. He didn't know that before sunset. Everything he thought he knew about his life, its limits, its loneliness, would change because of one timid knock and a little girl's shy smile. The knock came softly at first, more a question than a demand. Wyatt wiped his hands on his greasy coveralls and shuffled toward the door, the clang of his tools echoing behind him. Outside stood a young mother, hair pulled back in a tired knot, eyes darting nervously toward the street as if afraid someone might see her. Here, beside her, barely peeking around her coat, was a tiny girl in a battered wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a pink knitted hat too big for her, head and mismatched mittens that swallowed her fingers. Wyatt nodded to the mother, wordless as usual, letting her speak first. Her name was Caroline, she said, and this was Lily. Her voice cracked when she explained how Lily's old wheelchair had finally given up. Wheels jammed, brakes stuck, the small frame bent after too many bumps on Maple Creek's broken sidewalks. They had no money for a new one, no time to wait for charity paperwork. Caroline said they'd been to 3 shops already. Each turned them away, saying it wasn't worth fixing. Wyatt didn't say a word. He simply knelt beside Lily and smiled. Lily's eyes, hidden under the pink hat, studied him carefully. She didn't flinch. When Wyatt asked if she wanted him to try, she just nodded, the faintest spark flickering in eyes too used to disappointment. Wyatt rolled the squeaky chair inside, ignoring the grime that stained his worn gloves even darker. As the garage door rattled shut, Caroline's shoulders dropped. For the first time that week, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone left who gave a damn about an old chair and a broken street. The next few days blurred into one long shift under the soft flicker of a single bulb. Wyatt took the wheelchair apart, piece by piece, every squeal of the rusty bolts echoing like a promise. He soaked bearings in oil, hammered out dents and welded new joints from scrap he found behind the garage. When parts wouldn't fit, he made them fit. When rust laughed in his face, he sanded until the metal shone like a forgotten coin. He barely noticed the cold seeping through the thin walls or the ache in his knees as he knelt on concrete for hours. But late one night, as he studied the battered frame under a blanket of tools, Wyatt's eyes drifted toward the far corner of the shop, where, under dusty tarps, an old go-kart frame sat hidden like a memory. Years ago, his daughter had raced that thing through the fields behind the shop, pigtails flying behind her. She'd left Maple Creek long ago, but the cart stayed. Wyatt pushed aside the tarp, his heartbeat picking up as the idea took shape in his mind. He wasn't just going to fix Lily's wheelchair, he was going to build her something better. The next morning, Carolyn came by with a thermos of hot soup and found Wyatt hunched over the go-kart frame instead of the wheelchair. She gasped when he explained his plan, worry twisting her face. They had no money for fancy new wheels or high-end batteries, but Wyatt only chuckled, patting her arm with hands that smelled of grease and good intentions. He promised her he'd find a way. He always did. Besides, he said, what else did an old man like him have to do but build miracles out of scraps? Word spread quickly in Maple Creek. Wyatt Holloway was building a car for Lily Thompson. Neighbors dropped by with old bike parts, scooter wheels, and cracked plastic seats they'd long forgotten in their sheds. Local kids peeked in after school, wide-eyed at the sparks flying as Wyatt welded pieces together. Some nights he'd find a small bag of bolts or a can of paint left quietly at his doorstep. Wyatt, who had spent years fixing strangers' trucks without expecting so much as a thank you, found himself surrounded by quiet acts of kindness. Lily started visiting more often, her laughter echoing off oil-stained walls like sunshine on metal. She'd sit on an old stool, legs dangling, asking Wyatt endless questions about wires and engines. He showed her how to hold a wrench, how to test the brake cables, how to adjust the small steering wheel he'd salvaged from an abandoned toy Jeep. Caroline watched from the side, eyes brimming with something between disbelief and relief. For the first time in years, she saw her daughter dreaming big, giggling like any kid should. One night, Wyatt sat back, sweat cooling on his neck, as he admired the half-finished miracle in front of him. The cherry-red paint glowed under the shop light, fresh tires gleamed, and the small battery hummed like a heartbeat waiting to race. He knew it wasn't perfect. Nothing built in Wyatt's garage ever was, but it was. Strong enough to carry a little girl faster than she'd ever gone, strong enough to remind him that his hands, though rough and cracked, still held purpose beyond fixing broken tractors. When the day came for Lily's first ride, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Wyatt opened the garage doors wide, sunlight pouring over the polished frame. Lily's eyes widened when she saw the tiny car, her car. She reached out, trembling, touching the smooth paint like it might vanish if she blinked. Caroline helped her in, buckling her small legs securely. Wyatt knelt beside her, whispering instructions. She barely heard over her racing heartbeat. He gave the wheel a gentle push. The little car rolled forward, smooth and steady. Neighbors stepped onto their porches. Phones came out. A breeze caught Lily's laughter as she cruised down the sidewalk, tiny hands gripping the wheel, hair dancing under her pink helmet. She looked back. Wyatt, her eyes shining with something he hadn't seen before. Freedom. Caroline covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. Wyatt stood beside her, arms folded, a grin fighting through the beard he hadn't bothered to trim in weeks. He didn't care how he looked. He only cared about Lily's laugh echoing off Maple Creek's tired houses. That evening, when the last neighbors drifted home and the streetlights flickered on, Wyatt stayed behind in his garage, staring at the empty workbench. He should have felt exhausted, but his hands itched for more. He found himself sketching new ideas on oil-smudged paper, better batteries, smoother frames, maybe even small ramps for kids like Lily to practice on. He had no funding, no fancy degrees, just a stubborn heart and a garage full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, that was more than enough. He didn't know that far beyond Maple Creek, Lily's small adventure had already begun to spread. Caroline's sister, visiting from the city, had filmed the ride on her phone. She posted it late that night, captioning it with shaky fingers and a heart bursting with pride. "A kind mechanic built my niece a car when the world turned. It's back, look at her fly." The next morning, Wyatt's phone buzzed for the first time in weeks. Then it buzzed again and again. He frowned at the unfamiliar numbers, not knowing they were the start of something bigger than he'd ever dreamed. As dusk settled over Maple Creek, Wyatt stepped outside and leaned against the garage door. He looked at the quiet road where Lily's laughter still lingered like a song. He'd fixed countless things in his life: broken engines, dented doors, rusty tractors. But tonight he realized some things couldn't be fixed with a wrench alone. Sometimes they needed a heart big enough to see past the rust. Wyatt smiled at the thought, the old radio inside crackling out a soft tune as the stars woke above him, ready to see what tomorrow would bring. Wyatt woke before dawn 3 days later, confused by the echo of an unfamiliar ringtone. The old cell phone on his workbench buzzed across, oil-smeared sketches and half-drained coffee mugs. He rubbed his eyes, the chill of the garage biting at his bare arms as he answered. On the other end, a voice, too crisp, too confident for Maple Creek, introduced herself as Charlotte Gray. She spoke of things Wyatt had never heard before: viral clips, sponsorships, news, and coverage. She asked if she could come by to talk. Wyatt muttered a half-awake, "Sure," not realizing how his quiet yes would wake up the whole town. By midday, Wyatt knew something was up. Cars slowed in front of the garage. Strangers snapped photos from across the street. A pair of teenagers asked him shyly if he was the hero mechanic. He grunted an answer but didn't chase them off. Caroline called twice, voice bubbling with worry and excitement. She said her phone hadn't stopped ringing since her sister's clip of Lily had spread like wildfire. Wyatt just listened, watching the sun spill through the open garage door onto the same cracked floor he'd swept for decades. When the black limo finally pulled up, Wyatt almost laughed out loud. It looked ridiculous here in Maple Creek, too shiny, too perfect to belong next to the rusted pickups and faded barns. The driver stepped out first, polished shoes crunching on gravel. Then came Charlotte Gray, just as crisp as her voice, her suit too, fine for Wyatt's dusty domain. She offered him a handshake that felt like paper in his calloused grip. She peered inside the garage, lips pursed, eyes landing on Lily's minicar, resting proudly in the corner. Charlotte spoke fast, words dancing circles around Wyatt's slow nods. She talked about investors, features on morning shows, offers to build more custom vehicles for kids like Lily. She said the world needed more of what he'd done, his grit, his kindness. Wyatt listened, scratching at the edge of an old oil stain on his workbench. Part of him wanted to say no, to shut the door and go back to fixing fenders and tractors no one else cared about. But then he thought of Lily's giggle, the way her small fingers had traced the bright paint of that tiny car. Caroline and Lily arrived just as Charlotte finished her pitch. Lily squealed when she saw the limo, wheels spinning fast as Caroline pushed her up the short driveway. Charlotte knelt to greet Lily, voice softening as she complimented the brave little driver who'd made the world pay attention. Wyatt watched it all from behind crossed arms, the quiet guardian of a dream he hadn't known he'd built. He caught Caroline's eye and saw the same mix of hope and fear he felt simmering in his chest. They moved inside the garage, Charlotte perched on an upturned milk crate, Caroline clutching her coat tight around her shoulders. Wyatt leaned against his battered tool cabinet while Lily wheeled herself in circles around them, giggling at the echo of her own voice bouncing off metal walls. Charlotte laid out the plan, funding for a bigger shop, parts for more cars, maybe even a team to help Wyatt expand his ideas. She promised they'd handle the publicity, the money, the business deals. All Wyatt had to do was keep building miracles from junk. Wyatt asked for a moment alone. He stepped outside, boots crunching across the patch of weeds he'd always meant to clear. The cold wind cut through his coveralls, but he hardly felt it. He thought of his daughter's old go-kart, dusty for years until Lily's laughter brought it roaring back to life. He pictured the neighborhood kids stopping by, the quiet nods from neighbors who'd left bolts on his step when he needed them most. He thought about how he'd built more than just a car for Lily. He'd built a spark Maple Creek hadn't seen in years. When he returned, Charlotte stood, waiting for his answer with that polite impatience. Smiles city people wore when they thought they already knew how the story would end. Wyatt met Lily's eyes instead. She wheeled closer, reaching for his hand, her tiny palm pressed against his grease-stained knuckles, like a promise that if he kept going, more kids like her would get to feel what she felt, that burst of freedom, that rush of wind when life finally let them fly. Wyatt squeezed her hand, then looked at Charlotte and said two words that cracked his old voice wide. Open, let's try. The next few weeks flipped Wyatt's quiet life upside down. Reporters drove hours to Maple Creek, their fancy cameras tracking every move he made inside the dusty garage. Kids in wheelchairs came from towns Wyatt couldn't even spell. Parents called, emailed, begged for help. Wyatt, who once fixed old farm trucks for beer money, found himself designing blueprints with engineers half his age. Charlotte stayed busy behind her laptop, fielding sponsors and arranging TV spots. But when the door closed at night, Wyatt sat alone at his bench, sanding fresh frames until his hands ached. Caroline became his unofficial assistant, answering calls, shooing away reporters. When Wyatt needed a break, Lily claimed a corner of the shop as her own, setting up a small workbench with crayons, broken wheels, and scraps of wire. She asked questions no grown-up ever thought to. That's good. Why can't you make it pink? Can I paint flowers on the side? Do you think other kids will like it? Wyatt always answered with the same gentle grin, his yeses stronger than the thunder of the welding torch sparking behind him. It didn't take long for the garage to overflow. The old go-kart frame that had given Lily her freedom now inspired 3 more mini-cars in progress. Volunteers rolled in, some old friends, some new, faces drawn by the news story. A retired welder named Gus offered his steady, and a local high schooler named Ray brought a bag of donated bolts and a heart ready to learn. Together they built not just cars, but a place where kids who'd been told no all their lives finally heard a roaring yes. One afternoon, just before sunset, a shiny black town car pulled up, different from Charlotte's limo, sleeker, more serious. A man in a tailored coat stepped out, holding a cane in one hand and a letter in the other. His name was Mr. Warren, a philanthropist with a half-smile that said he'd seen enough bad deals to know a good heart when he found one. He watched Lily test drive her second mini-car, wheels spinning smooth as silk across Wyatt's cracked parking lot. He turned to Wyatt and asked how many more kids he could help if money weren't a problem. Wyatt didn't answer right away. He looked at the kids crowding around Lily, their parents watching from cars parked crooked along the curb. He imagined garages like his in every town, dusty workshops turned into tiny factories of freedom. He thought of late nights under single bulbs, tools clattering as laughter rang off walls that once only echoed silence. He turned back to Mr. Warren, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. As many as I can, he said, as many as they need. A week later, Maple Creek saw something it hadn't seen since the old factories shut down. Workers lining up at Wyatt's door, not for repairs but for jobs. With Mr. Warren's help, Charlotte's contacts, and Caroline's fierce heart, Wyatt's garage turned into the First Hol Works, a place where custom cars for kids like Lily rolled out one by one. Each car carried more than gears and wires. It carried Maple Creek's battered hope, repainted in bright colors and sent spinning down streets that once only knew potholes and cracked concrete. At night, when the last sparks died out and the new sign, Holloway Community Works, flickered in fresh neon above the door, Wyatt sat alone in the same spot where Lily's tiny wheels had squeaked through his life that first cold morning. He thought about the old days, his daughter's laughter, the bitter nights alone, the stubborn heartbeat that never let him quit. He thought about Lily, now racing down sidewalks faster than her mother's tears. Good keep up. He thought about every parent who'd knock on his door tomorrow, carrying dreams too big for silence. Wyatt didn't call himself a hero. He still refused interviews when the lights got too bright. He'd rather explain to a new father how to check a brake line than pose for glossy magazines. But when the sun rose each morning over Maple Creek, it found him there, hands buried in metal, surrounded by laughter and fresh blueprints. He'd built more than cars. He'd built second chances, and that, he decided, was more than enough for an old mechanic with rough hands and a stubborn, rust-proof heart. One night, as he locked up, Wyatt turned to see Caroline and Lily waiting by the new Holloway Works sign. Lily, now with a shiny helmet decorated in stickers, beamed up at him. "Mr. Wyatt," she asked, "will you help other kids too?" Wyatt bent down, brushing a grease-stained thumb across her cheek, then nodded. "That's the plan, kiddo." As the neon sign buzzed softly overhead, Lily's giggle rose into the star-filled night, proof that sometimes the smallest wheels could carry the biggest dreams home.